Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real privilege to talk in this series. I've heard so many good things about it. So I'm going to talk about transdiagnostic approaches to mental health. And I'm a clinical psychologist and I mostly work on developing psychological therapies. So this is really a psychological perspective rather than, say, a pharmacological perspective on these things. And the talk is actually an update of this paper that myself and some colleagues wrote a few years ago. I was asked to write an introduction to a special issue, so I think they expected 1 or 2 pages, but I ended up writing 50 pages. And because it was an introduction, they didn't seem to feel they could tell me to rewrite it. So if anyone's got the appetite, you can plough your way through this very, very long paper. So I think the first thing I was going to say is that as long as humans have been reflecting on the nature of their own experience, they've really sought to categorize what used to be called madness, but just different types of mental distress. And we've got these current instantiations of this, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the ICD-11. But it's important to remember that they're just our current flavour of the month or flavour of the 100 years in the case of the DSM almost. And that actually there's been many, many previous attempts to do this that are very, very different, and I'm sure in the future, and that's some of the things we'll talk about today perhaps, there'll be many other ways of trying to think about how we might categorize mental distress. And I think the reason for this is because there is something fundamental about the way people struggle with navigating their way through life that looks like there's distinct problems that they begin to encounter and begin to express. So there's something fundamentally true about the nature of categorization of different ways that people have difficulties. So the question isn't really, is that a sensible thing to be doing? There's thousands of years of history which suggests that there's some kind of mandate to do that. The question is our current way of doing it, the current psychiatric diagnostic system, really still the best way to do it, given everything we already know. So I was going to start by talking about the diagnostic system and some things that we might be concerned about with it. I'm just keeping an eye on the time as well. So I'm just going to start with a diagnosis we might all be familiar with, which is major depressive disorder. So of course there's this notion of depression. We all kind of have a sense of what depression is, but it's defined in this very formal way in the DSM-5 and very similarly in the ICD. And there's these kind of 9 symptoms, and you have to have 5 of these symptoms within a period of 2 weeks to be given a diagnosis of a major depressive episode. And then if you've got an episode, you can either have a diagnosis of a major depressive disorder or a persistent depressive disorder. There's a variety of different instantiations of depression. So this is the current view of what depression looks like in this very formalized taxonomy. So the question then is this really the best way for us to be thinking about these things or not? So the idea of depression comes from this work a long time ago by Cassidy, and this really interesting paper, which was driven by observations of many patients he saw in the clinic and then sort of systematically tried to capture the variety of symptoms for 100 of them and describe them in this paper. And what he says here is these serious consequences, and he's talking about the symptoms of these people who he's working with, who are all inpatients, the worst of which is death by suicide, make it important for doctors to learn to diagnose this common disease accurately. This can be done by the simple clinical pointers presented here. And he presented a small number of symptoms which are the precursor of the current DSM diagnosis. And he says knowledge of these facts is essential for the diagnosis and treatment of manic depressive disease, one of the most common psychiatric disorders. So he's hitting on why people are so enthusiastic about this way of doing things. First of all, it allows you to identify a constellation of problems which seem to occur. It gives you a shorthand to communicate to patients, to other healthcare workers and other people involved what you're talking about. When you use these labels, people know what you mean. It allows you to predict once you've got a certain number of symptoms that other symptoms might be present or might come along, such as risk of suicide. it pushes you towards a particular way of managing the problem, treatment or management in different ways, and it provides an acknowledgement to the person who is being labelled that perhaps they've got some ill health problem which might actually be beneficial to them in terms of the way they think about themselves. So there's lots of good reasons why we would want to be clustering distress into these different packages. And as I said, the question is, what's the best way to do that, not should we get rid of it completely. So I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why I think the current way of doing it is a bit of a problem. So the first is the current diagnostic system is full of arbitrary decisions. And this really comes out of its evolution. So if we look at the historical trajectory, say, of the DSM, which I took the depression diagnosis for, then in the DSM-1, DSM-2, it was an incredibly psychoanalytic manual. So it was very heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory. And then there was a whole pivot around the DSM-3 where they decided to make it completely atheoretical. So no longer do we want this to be a psychoanalytic approach. We want it to be a set of symptoms which is not grounded in any theory at all. So immediately we see these sort of arbitrary socio-historical factors influencing what might be constituted as a problem, what might not be, how things get clustered. And there's lots of other evidence of these sort of sociological influences. So many of the disorders which are in the DSM have come and gone or been completely reframed over time as a function not of their clinical presentation, in other words, what you might think of the symptoms, but as a function of the way they're framed within broader society. So an example would be something like homosexuality, which in the DSM originally was seen as a sort of perversion of personality and something that had to be eliminated. There was then this slight softening towards a notion of ego-dystonic homosexuality, so only if you didn't want to be a homosexual would it be seen as a disorder. And now, of course, quite rightly, from our current perspective, it's completely not in the DSM at all. So as the sociological view of these things changed, so what constitutes a disorder changes. And this is a really worrying basis for having a kind of manual of medical problems, that they can be so subject to the vagaries of sociological development. Another example would be something like autism. So before the DSM-5, there were different diagnoses of autism and Asperger's syndrome, and they were all collapsed into the current diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder. And of course that really distressed a lot of people who'd had a diagnosis for their whole lives, and suddenly they no longer met criteria for this diagnosis overnight, which just shows you how arbitrary it is. So the way they managed that was to say, well, if you had a diagnosis before, you can kind of inherit the new diagnosis. Even though you don't meet the criteria for it, you still get to have the diagnosis of ASD once the DSM-5 comes out. And there's been many, many examples of these kind of changes. Another one would be premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is now in the DSM-5 but was originally taken out because of women's rights movements in the 70s saying we don't want things like this which are part and parcel of being a woman being pathologized. And now the whole view is shifted, and almost the view is, well, if men had this, it would be the first disorder on the list. So we want our acknowledgement that this is a really distressing thing to go through for some women. So again, very different views, and the disorder moves out of the DSM and then back into the DSM. And Kendler did a really good thought experiment. He said, well, if these psychiatric disorders are really the sorts of things that they're put forward to being kind of carved in stone categories of mental distress, you should be able to do a thought experiment where you get in a time machine, you go back 100 years and you relive the last 100 years again, and each time you should end up with something like the DSM-5. And I think we all think, well, that just wouldn't happen. It would be different every single time. And so it shows that it's a function of a social history as much as anything else. Also, the arbitrariness is actually not very consistent within the DSM. So not only are lots of the decisions arbitrary, but they're arbitrary in different ways. So many of the chapters are divided by predominant symptoms like mood disorders, anxiety disorders, but others are all around time of onset, neurodevelopmental disorders, neurocognitive disorders, or sometimes they're around etiology. Is it a traumatic stress disorder? So there's no consistency in how the disorders are framed, and that's because they've all grown organically and they're all decided by working groups and committees who really don't really talk to each other. So there'll be a kind of PTSD working group which just focuses on traumatic stress disorders and are we thinking about them in the right way, but doesn't really think about whether they're consistent or not with other disorders. And of course we know that trauma is actually really important for almost every disorder in the DSM, but it's actually thought of in a much narrower way. And this leads to huge heterogeneity. So rather than clear blue water between one diagnosis and another, actually many of the diagnoses have overlapping symptoms. And that means that it's very, very unusual clinically to meet someone who only has a single psychiatric diagnosis. They nearly always have significant symptoms of another diagnosis. And also they all present, even within the same diagnosis, like I put the criteria for depression, they all present in slightly different ways. So how many different ways do people think you could have a diagnosis of depression based on those 9 odd symptoms? Some of them go in different directions. You overeat, you undereat, you wake early. But how many different ways can you get depression, do you think? Any guesses? $16,400 different ways. So this is a disorder that's supposed to be kind of monolithic. This is depression. It's actually 16,400 different ways you can meet the criteria to be depressed. And once you go to a quite complicated disorder like PTSD, where you've got different clusters of symptoms, it's just a ridiculous number of symptoms, of ways, 635,000 plus ways you can meet criteria for PTSD. So the heterogeneity is normal. You can meet patients for quite a long time and find some that don't have a single symptom in common. Also, the heterogeneity changes over time, so someone could be depressed and then have an episode later, and it could have no similarity whatsoever to the previous episode that they've had. There's also, diagnosis relies on this projection of a kind of binary way of thinking in 2 ways. First of all, do you have the diagnosis or don't you? But underlying that, do you have the symptom or don't you? And we know that most of these symptoms are actually on continua. It's not like other medical conditions where there might be a much clearer boundary. So these are dimensional experiences upon which a binary set of categories is being projected. So I've talked about depression and the 16,400 ways you can get depressed, but actually that most of the symptoms of depression are not captured in that list of 9. So if you take our top 7 depression measures, they cover about 52 symptoms, and none of them actually covers all 9 on the DSM. So there's enormous numbers of symptoms that aren't covered. And then when you move to look at how many depression measures there are out there in the literature, it's about 300, and they cover, about 400 different symptoms of depression. So on the one hand, the symptoms are very narrow, but there's still huge heterogeneity. On the other hand, they're missing lots of the problems that you would want to be working with clinically if you met someone with depression. And then there's comorbidity, which is linked to heterogeneity, as I said. So if you have one mental health problem, you're very, very likely to have another. So PTSD is a perfect example. It almost never presents on its own. Huge comorbidity with these other disorders. And you can see here why that might be. So if you've got the PTSD symptoms on the left, you can see the clusters that I mentioned, the intrusion, avoidance, mood, cognitive, arousal clusters, and the symptoms are in the second column. But then you've got the symptoms that overlap with depression anxiety, mania, and psychosis in the following columns. So these are the same symptoms. Because these disorders are decided on essentially all somewhat independently, the same symptoms keep occurring in different disorders. So depression and PTSD, most of the symptoms are the same if you look at it. So it's quite hard to not meet criteria for a diagnosis of depression if you meet criteria for a diagnosis of PTSD. And finally, if you look at the underlying processes, there's this great book with some colleagues of mine, it's a bit old now, but sort of really put this idea to the forefront. If you look at the underlying processes that drive mental health problems, whether they be social, biological, cognitive, genetic, there's almost no specificity to a particular disorder. So the underlying processes are cutting across these diagnostic boundaries. They're very generic risk factors. So things like attention, memory, reasoning, thinking, behavior in the cognitive domain, these kinds of broad biases in these processes are actually common to multiple conditions. And in fact, there's virtually no processes, just like there aren't that many symptoms that are specific to just one disorder. So there's 7, I've called them 7 sins, 7 reasons why we might be concerned about the current diagnostic picture. And you could say, well, that's not so bad. I mean, we can think of these as sociological constructs with fuzzy boundaries, and they're still useful as a way of thinking about mental distress. So why is that such a problem? And I think part of it is because there's a really pervasive view in psychiatry over a long period of time, and in many other ways of thinking about diagnoses, that doesn't think of them in that way. Instead, they're thought of as almost like natural kinds. These are real things in the world that people can get. So depression is a real thing. It's not subject to the vagaries of socio-historical pressures. It's not very difficult to distinguish from other things. It's a real thing that someone could get, and it's its own monolithic entity. So this idea was really introduced by Karl Jaspers, and what he was saying here is the main task of psychiatry, writing it just over 100 years ago now, one of the fathers of psychiatry, is to find the natural disease units which are distinct in principle and without overlap from each other, and which have the same symptoms, cause and physical abnormalities. So that was the mission, and that led to the development of these diagnostic manuals. So you might think, well, that was a long time ago. If we were all subject to what was said more than 100 years ago, we'd be in trouble. But you still find these views very, very commonly. So this is from Regier et al. About 10 years ago. The task of psychiatry is to recognise the most prominent syndromes that are actually present in nature. So not socially constructed, actually present in nature. And commenting on this, Lieberman and Insel said, most psychiatrists actually believe that the diseases they diagnose using the DSM are real, but there is no reality. These are just constructs. There's no reality to schizophrenia or depression. So that's a little bit of a critique of the current system. So it's easy to sit and criticise. The key thing is, are there plausible alternatives that we may wish to consider? And there's a whole bunch of these, and I won't have time to go into them all, but just to highlight 3 here. So on the top left, we have the RDoC, the Research Diagnostic Criteria. So this was a framework put together by NIMH in the US, actually led by Tom Insel, for whom that quote I just said at the end came from. And this is a way of trying to look at, put diagnoses aside and actually look at collections of underlying biopsychosocial processes. And then also on the top we have network analysis. So network analysis view is something like depression is just a latent variable which is used to describe an interacting set of symptoms that can't be considered in isolation but have to be considered as part of a dynamic network. And then HiTOP at the bottom, which is a hierarchical taxonomy of psychopathology, which basically takes all of the symptoms from many, many research studies and tries to show that there's meaningful ways of thinking about these at different levels of analysis that are quite different to diagnosis. So there are these alternative approaches, and the question is, are they really delivering anything better than what we already have? So you can immediately see, in terms of, say, symptoms, that, well, HiTOP just takes the same symptoms and mixes them all up and pumps them out again. There's no other processes involved. These are still surface level symptoms. So immediately, if you're a psychologist, you're thinking, well, you know, I don't really work on managing symptoms. I work on psychological processes. So that immediately makes you feel that that's not going to be very helpful. Same with the original instantiations of network analysis. More recent ones are folding in processes as well. So there's some immediate problems. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about the RDoC. So what the RDoC has is a set of domains. There's actually another one now called motor systems, but they're domains of processing which can be conceptualized, as you can see in the downward, the words at 90 degrees. You can conceptualize these domains at multiple levels: genetic, molecular, circuit levels, social levels, behavioral levels, and so on. And then they're all framed within a kind of nature-nurture type way of thinking. But the domains are negative valence domains, so you know, bad stuff happening; positive valence domains, and that could be impoverishment of positive valence; cognitive domains, social domains, and psychophysiological arousal domain. And as I said, there's now a motor domain. And what the RDoC wants you to do is not worry about diagnoses, but think about quadrants within this. So you might base your research questions around the genetics of the negative valence domain. So just one of these squares. And those are the questions you're going to start asking. So what do we understand about this, and how does it relate to other things like symptoms? So it's trying to set aside the idea of diagnosis and allow you to pick your unit of analysis. Is it going to be symptoms? Is it going to be a cluster of symptoms? Is it going to be a set of diagnoses? And it stops reifying diagnoses. So there's many positive aspects of this. So one problem with this, which I'll come to, but I'm just going to set the scene for it now, is that despite the RDoC supposedly making all of these domains, you know, equal players and a level playing field, it's actually very, very neurocognitive. So Eco-Fried did a really good analysis of this. He says brain disorders, brain circuit disorders, dysfunction of neural circuits that can be identified with the tools of clinical neuroscience. These are all quotes from the RDoC, and that are treated by tuning these neural circuits, ultimately leading to neuroscience-based psychiatric classification. So one problem with the RDoC is that although it sets itself out as this kind of level and equal opportunity way of looking at different processes, it's actually was incredibly focused on neuroscience. And there's this great quote from Insel. After he'd set the RDoC up, he worked for 13 years at NIMH, and then he left. And he said, 13 years at NIMH, I was really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. So at least he's admitting now that the RDoC wasn't what he said it was when he set it up. He said, I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists. He didn't say in cool journals, but I think he also means that, at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion. But I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. So a real problem with the RDoC is this focus on brain conditions, this very, very reductionist way of thinking. And there's some more quotes here which just talk about the issues with that kind of approach. So some other problems with it are that it's also, as with the DSM, completely atheoretical. So this is presented as a real kind of advantage, that we're not wedding ourselves to one theory or another. We're this sort of agnostic way of thinking. But actually, my own view is that as soon as you take theory away, it becomes almost essentially useless. So in the end, we're in my world, we're in the business of developing psychological interventions. So you've got to have a theory of why people have mental difficulties and what things about those difficulties you might be able to change, and then how can you develop an intervention to change them. So you've got to know, well, what are the red herrings? Are there processes in this huge matrix that we could research on, like attentional bias to threat? Loads of money has gone into that, but actually it's much more of an epiphenomenon of having anxiety or depression. It's not something that's really causal. So what's causal and what's not causal requires us to have tight theories about what's going on. And if we don't have those, then all of these boxes are essentially equal to each other, and we have no notion of what is going to just lead us down a rabbit hole or what's going to be highly productive. And also we need to focus on things that we think we can really change. So a good example, I think it was Kennedy who did this, was imagine a plane crashes because something goes wrong with the engine. In an RDoC approach, we take all the theory out and say, well, there's two things here. There's gravity. Gravity was a problem because when the engine failed, the plane crashed. And then there's the engine problem. So theoretically, well, where do you start in trying to solve that problem? But with a theory of like, well, I know I can't change gravity, but I can change the way we build the engines, you immediately know where to look. But as soon as you try to start from square one, then you really could go after causal things that are completely intractable. So I think there's lots of other problems with the RDoC, not just its reductionist cognitive neuroscience stance. So I was asked to talk for 30 to 35 minutes, so I'm just going to go ahead a bit. So what are the clinical implications then? If we want to think differently from a diagnostic model, if we have concerns about some of the alternatives, I've just touched on a small number of the concerns with RDoC, but we could have had a similar conversation about network approaches and the hierarchical approaches. Putting that aside, what are the clinical implications of trying to think differently from the diagnostic model? So there's been a whole swathe now of attempts to develop transdiagnostic interventions which try to cut across these traditional nosological distinctions that we find in the psychiatric manuals. And again, I'm just going to briefly mention some of them. So the first is to say, well, we're not going to really adapt our intervention at all to what someone's diagnosis might be. We're going to identify some universally relevant therapeutic principles, and everybody's just going to get exactly the same thing. And there's been quite a lot of approaches like that. So the Unified Protocol for Emotional Disorders is a really good example. So essentially, it's a certain set of sessions which focus on key processes that are seen to underpin anxiety, depression, obsessional states, and trauma states. And everybody gets the same stuff in the same order at the same dose. And it's got good outcomes. The other type of approach is more of a modular approach where you say, let's put diagnostic labels to one side, but let's still look at the individual's current set of problems, not just at a symptom level, but in terms of processes or social difficulties. And what we'll do is we'll have a whole suite of treatment elements in our toolbox, and we'll say for this person, we need these tools, just like you would if you were working with anything. And we'll do these tools in this order with this level of intensity. So you tailor the intervention not to the diagnosis, but to the individual clinical presentation. And these tend to have better outcomes than the unified approach, but of course it's much harder to deliver. It's much harder to train people to learn this technique because they have to do this formulation stage where they work out, well, what does this person need, in what order, and with what level of intensity. But there's a number of protocols like that. And we've developed one of these very briefly called Shaping Healthy Minds, just to give you a flavour of it. And what this tries to do is say, rather than think about this is the high top hierarchy I showed you earlier. Rather than think about all these diagnoses you can see listed in the middle kind of strata, we actually think that most people fall within this broad cluster of fear and distress. And they present with the different types of symptoms, and they may or may not meet a diagnosis for a particular disorder, or 2 disorders, or 3 or 4. That's really neither here nor there. They're in this cluster and they have problems, and you can formulate the nature of those problems, and then you can pick these different modules from your toolbox to work with people on those problems. So what it's saying is, let's move up a level from the level of diagnosis and think about these more generic distress markers, and then within that we'll individually tailor the intervention for that person. And so our version, Shaping Healthy Minds, has 10 modules, just to give you a flavour of it. And the first one, Getting Acquainted, and the last one, Relapse Prevention, are mandatory. Everything else is up for grabs. So if someone comes with a specific phobia of spiders, something really simple, they'd get acquainted, probably not for very long. You'd do some tackling avoidance, module 5, and then you'd say goodbye. So from the very simple intervention, whereas someone comes with complex PTSD, they'd have the understanding emotions, tolerating emotions, all the stuff on memory, managing upsetting memories in module 9 and so on. So it'd be a much more complex set of modules. So it's completely tailored to the individual, and it can deal with very mild problems to very complex problems. But as I said, the difficulty with it is, how do you decide? So this is just one snippet of our kind of algorithm on how you choose which modules, and which we have to use to train people. So it's very, very difficult to train people on how to deliver this intervention. But just briefly, we completed our first trial, and I won't talk through too much of the results, but essentially it offers really good outcomes, and this is compared to gold standard CBT interventions. So it's outperforming diagnosis-led CBT. So what you've got then is one intervention which is hard to learn. It's all these different modules, there's this complex algorithm, but it's up against something like 41 CBT protocols that you choose based on diagnosis. And it outperforms that smorgasbord of 41 different protocols, which is currently how the NHS operates. So I'm going to stop there because I've got to my 35 minutes. But thank you. I hope you've got a bit of a flavour of some of the problems with the current way we think, some of the problems with the alternatives, and how we're trying to manage clinically, even in the face of this uncertainty. And just thanks to my colleagues as well. Thank you.